Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Euromissiles, the nuclear weapons that nearly destroyed NATO, by Susan Colbourn, narrated by Wendy Tremont King. How can you explain to people that you defend peace and freedom with weapons which, if they, once they are used, will destroy mankind? Hans Oppel. If there are enough nuclear weapons now in Europe to destroy the continent 30 times over, what does it matter if one side can do it 14 times and the other 16? E.P. Thompson. Abbreviations. ABM, Anti-Ballistic Missile. CDU, Christlich-Demokratische Union, Christian Democratic Union, Federal Republic of Germany. CFE, Conventional Armed Forces in Europe. CND, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. CSCE, Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe. CSU, Christlich-Soziale Union in Bayonne, Christian Social Union of Bavaria, Federal Republic of Germany. END, or END, European Nuclear Disarmament. FCO, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, United Kingdom. FDP, Freie Demokratische Partei, Free Democratic Party, Federal Republic of Germany. FOTL, Follow-on to Lance. FRG, Federal Republic of Germany. IKV, Interkerkelijk Vredesberaad, Interchurch Peace Council. INF, Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces. IRBM, Intermediate Range Ballistic Missile. LTDP, Long-Term Defense Program. MAE, Ministre des Affaires étrangères, France. MBFR, Mutual and Balanced Force Reduction. MLF, Multilateral Force. MRBM, Medium Range Ballistic Missile. NATO, or NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NPG, Nuclear Planning Group. NSC, National Security Council, United States. SACEUR, or SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander, Europe. SALT, or SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. SED, Socialist Unity Party of Germany, Sozialistische Einheitspartie Deutschlands, German Democratic Republic. SNF, Short-Range Nuclear Forces. SPD, Sozialdemokratische Partei Deutschlands, Social Democratic Party, Federal Republic of Germany. START, or START, Strategic Arms Reduction Talks. TASM, Tactical Air-to-Surface Missile. TNF, Theater Nuclear Forces. Note on terminology. The terminology used to describe nuclear weapons can cause a lot of confusion. Categories and labels were constantly in flux, shaped by new strategic doctrines, new weapons systems, and new arms control agreements that set out and defined new classes of nuclear weapons. For much of the 1950s and 1960s, weapons were divided into two categories, strategic and tactical. Strategic use tended to refer to the prospect of firing on military targets, known as counter-force, or industrial and urban targets, known as counter-value. Whereas tactical use remained much more localized and circumscribed to battlefield use. The proliferation of new weapons systems, such as nuclear-capable aircraft, blurred the lines between these two. A nuclear war fought in Europe with tactical weapons would be strategic for Europeans. Advances in technology and the emergence of new weapons spurred another category: theater nuclear forces. After the first use of this term at NATO in the late 1960s, theater nuclear forces remained the common shorthand for the alliance's various nuclear weapons within Europe. That category was divided yet further, sorting systems with different strike ranges, such as longer-range theater nuclear forces. In the early 1980s, the terminology shifted again, replacing the shorthand theater nuclear forces, TNF, with intermediate-range nuclear forces, INF. Introduction. Security and Survival. E.P. Thompson paced back and forth before a packed hall. At the historic Oxford Union Debating Society on February 27, 1984, the eminent socialist historian and veteran peace campaigner brandished two pamphlets. One was Soviet military power, the latest glossy overview of Moscow's military might, produced by the U.S. Department of Defense. The other was the Soviet rebuttal, Whence the Threat to Peace. Waving the two, Thompson reminded his audience that just two men had controlled the vast arsenal catalogued therein throughout the tense autumn of 1983. Neither inspired much confidence. Yuri Andropov, the recently deceased Soviet General Secretary, had been on a kidney machine and half dead from the neck down. Andropov's opposite number in Washington, Ronald Reagan, Thompson quipped, was on an auto-cue machine and half dead from the neck up. Thompson's sparring partner for the evening, Caspar Weinberger, looked on, pencil in hand, jotting down notes on a scrap of paper. The sitting U.S. Secretary of Defense had made the trip across the Atlantic to plead Washington's case before a student debating society. The two men were an improbable pair, a prominent peace activist and a sitting cabinet secretary with a decidedly hawkish reputation. "Nothing like this has happened," the night's host, Edwin Newman, told viewers tuning in from the comfort of their own living rooms. The resolution being debated that night? That there was no moral difference between the foreign policies of the United States and the Soviet Union. The view of the United States that is implicit in that motion, Newman explained, is placing the Western alliance under severe strain, threatening to split it, perhaps even destroy it. This book is about how the North Atlantic Treaty Organization narrowly escaped such a fate. That story revolves around the rise and fall of three kinds of missiles: SS-20 ballistic missiles, Pershing II ballistic missiles, and Griffin ground-launched cruise missiles. Together, they came to be known as the Euromissiles. These weapons, usually called theater nuclear forces or, later, intermediate-range nuclear forces, targeted the great cities of Europe on both sides of the divided continent. Armed with these, and thousands of other nuclear weapons systems, along with hundreds of thousands of troops, the United States and the Soviet Union could obliterate Europe and bring about World War III. Typically, the history of the Euromissiles follows a familiar arc. After the Soviet Union began deploying the SS-20s, In the mid-1970s, when this story often starts, the Western Allies banded together to upgrade their own forces in Europe. With December 1979's dual-track decision, NATO's members plan to deploy a new generation of U.S. missiles to bases across Western Europe. In Belgium, the Federal Republic of Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom, starting in 1983. Record-breaking demonstrations across the West tried to derail these deployments, as did a vigorous propaganda campaign by the Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies in the Warsaw Pact. But NATO stood firm. In the autumn of 1983, the first U.S. missiles arrived, and U.S.-Soviet talks collapsed. A mere 4 years later, the United States and the Soviet Union signed an arms control agreement that embraced the seemingly impossible negotiating position the Reagan administration had first put forward in the autumn of 1981, to get rid of these weapons entirely. Under the terms of the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed in December 1987, Reagan and his Soviet counterpart, General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, agreed to eliminate an entire class of weapons, dismantling and destroying every land-based missile with a range from 500 to 5,500 kilometers. To reach that agreement, Gorbachev went much further than Reagan, agreeing to deep cuts, far outstripping those required of the United States, and leaving Washington's advantages in air and sea-based systems unchecked. At every step, it seemed the perfect policy outcome for the Western Allies. But it was hardly so smooth in practice. Hindsight, and the certainty it affords, can make what ultimately transpired seem like the most logical or likely outcome, perhaps even one that could be easily replicated. For the Western Allies, the successive decisions to field, deploy, and destroy the Euromissiles involved high-stakes gambles that might not have paid off. In the sections that follow, I tell a transatlantic history of the Euromissiles, from the arms race's origins in the early 1960s to the final days of the Cold War. Revisiting that history is a stark reminder of just how fragile the Atlantic Alliance remained, even as communist governments across Europe hemorrhaged money, and workers fled the workers' paradise. NATO's history is not neatly packaged, tucked away in the Alliance's archives in Brussels. The Atlantic Alliance does not work that way, and any historian of NATO quickly confronts a deceptively simple question. What are we actually talking about when we talk about NATO? At first glance, the answer seems straightforward. An alliance of like-minded North American and Western European states. But each of those 15, and after Spain's ascension in 1982, 16 countries, had its own national interests, security priorities, and fears. An organizational chart of NATO is a bit like a work of abstract art, covered in boxes and lines denoting dozens of commands and committees and their various offshoots, both civilian and military. The Atlantic Alliance has a language all its own, too, its documents replete with technical jargon and acronyms. And yet, despite these deliberative bodies and common shorthands, much of the alliance's decision-making occurs outside NATO's formal councils, taking place in national bodies, bilateral meetings, or ad hoc gatherings. Even Within NATO's committees, officials would sit behind a placard bearing a country's name and were expected to represent their country's interests, not those of the alliance writ large. NATO's members did not have an equal degree of influence. The United States, with its economic power, superpower status, and nuclear arsenal, was unquestionably first among equals. As a result, we are often tempted to simplify the alliance's political process, casting it as a mere extension of Washington's preferences, or the purview of only a few major players. But the premium placed on Allied cohesion gave each member a voice, no matter its size or relative power. Any history of NATO is an attempt to capture and organize an unruly web of individual members' foreign policy priorities, domestic political pressures, and jockeying between Allied governments. This book is no different. But while NATO occupies center stage, the history covered in the following 12 chapters also extends far beyond the councils of the alliance. Here, I put policymakers in conversation with protesters to show how and why the Euromissiles mattered. We already know a great deal about the Euromissiles. No shortage of contemporaries followed the twists and turns of the superpowers' arms control talks, fretted over the tensions between the Western allies, and tried to make sense of what those protesting the Euromissiles hoped to achieve. Armed with a growing body of accessible archival evidence, historians have revisited old lines of inquiry and charted new ones, delving into the diplomatic, political, social, and cultural history of the Euromissiles. But few have put these various approaches together. This book does just that. It is a history of diplomacy and alliance politics, of social movements, and of strategy. It is about nuclear weapons and nagging fears, and about politics both high and low. Only by putting these various strands back in conversation can we fully appreciate how and why the Western Allies made policy as they did, how their adversaries and electorates shaped those calculations, and why those choices mattered. Writing that kind of history took me to archives on both sides of the Atlantic. I used the records of alliance committees, national governments, and anti-nuclear campaigners from Belgium, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and the United States, to understand why the saga of the Euromissiles captivated so many. As I pored over meeting minutes, press clippings, and television spots, I became increasingly skeptical of the language we often rely on to make sense of the Euromissiles. Scholars almost instinctively use the language of crisis. The episode is a slow-motion Cuban Missile Crisis, or simply the Euromissiles crisis. Yet the contours of that crisis remain ill-defined. Was it triggered, as is often suggested, by Helmut Schmidt's October 1977 speech at London's International Institute of Strategic Studies, when the German Chancellor seemed to publicly question the U.S. military commitment to Europe? Certainly Schmidt did not think so. He pointed to a first mistake much earlier, in the early 1960s, when the United States removed a set of ground-based missiles from NATO's arsenal in Europe. An endpoint is no more certain. Did the crisis wind down when NATO began deploying the Pershing IIs and Glickums, as almost everyone called the ground-launched cruise missiles, at the end of 1983? Or with the signing of the INF Treaty 4 years later? Nor is there any consensus about what exactly the essential ingredients of that crisis were. In other words, what made the crisis a crisis? There are any number of potential contenders: the nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, the increased risk, both real and perceived, that a nuclear war might break out in Europe, the Cold War's seeming return to Europe and the widespread anxieties triggered by that realization, and the fracturing of the security consensus, to name but a few. Did the crisis pit NATO's members against their adversaries in the Warsaw Pact? Or were the sources of crisis internal to the Atlantic Alliance? The more I dug into these questions, the more convinced I became that there were crises of all shapes and sizes everywhere. Crisis was nothing new in Allied circles. NATO's history is one of near-constant crisis. Earlier episodes of transatlantic turmoil had divided the Western Allies in public rows. The Suez Crisis called into question the continued purpose of their alliance. The so-called NATO crisis triggered by Charles de Gaulle, and threatened to unravel critical components of their defenses, the offset crisis. The NATO crisis, as Schmidt put it, appears as the Loch Ness Monster does every summer in the British papers. The obsession with crisis can obscure as much as it reveals. What set the Euromissiles apart was not the nature of the problems plaguing the Western Allies, but the severity and frequency of these problems. The various overlapping struggles over the Euromissiles exposed fault lines and uneasy compromises that had been present in the Atlantic Alliance for decades, dating back to its creation in the late 1940s. NATO's structure, in other words, was one virtually guaranteed to produce crises. 4 dilemmas defined NATO's structure of crisis throughout the Cold War. The first flowed from the Allies' relationship with the Soviet Union. As long as the Soviet Union posed a clear and present danger to the Western Allies, fear of the Kremlin was the glue that bound them together. If and when the threat posed by the Soviet Union appeared to wane, so too would the case for NATO. The second stemmed from the asymmetrical distribution of power among the Allies. NATO's arrangements depended on the United States' commitment to protect Europe. Yet, that protection could easily be called into question. What if the Western Allies no longer believed that commitment was credible, or, at the other end of the spectrum, that the U.S. weapons used to provide protection made war more, not less, likely? The third of these dilemmas was an extension of that logic. To keep the Soviets out and the Americans in, the Western Allies relied on the destructive power of nuclear weapons. NATO's planners touted these terrible weapons as a guarantor of peace. But the human costs, should deterrence fail, would be catastrophic. The fourth dilemma revolved around the West Germans, who, more than any of the other allies, depended on these arrangements to ensure their security. What if those in the Federal Republic of Germany, its leaders, or its voters, lost faith in the transatlantic bargain? Since the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty in April 1949, the Western Allies had struggled to develop a viable strategy that met the political, economic, and military requirements of NATO's members. Nuclear weapons offered a way out. making it possible to endorse a forward strategy as far east as possible, without the considerable political and financial costs of matching the massive standing armies of the Soviet bloc. Yet, NATO's reliance on nuclear weapons was a fragile arrangement. Any attempt to project military power to other territories as a form of protective cover, as the United States did through NATO, was more art than science. To fight abroad is a military act, Thomas Schelling observed, but to persuade enemies or allies that one would fight abroad under circumstances of great cost and risk requires more than military capability. It requires projecting intentions. It requires having those intentions, even deliberately acquiring them, and communicating them persuasively to make other countries behave. But huddled together under the nuclear umbrella held up by the United States, the other allies routinely worried about what would happen if a storm actually came. Would the United States use its nuclear arsenal to defend its allies in Europe? If officials in Washington did follow through on their promises, was that even desirable? Victory in the atomic age might look devastatingly similar to defeat. After 1967, NATO's strategic doctrine envisioned a concept of escalation often referred to as flexible response. With a greater range of options for the use of force, nuclear and otherwise, the thinking went, the Western Allies could respond to Soviet aggression without resorting to all-out nuclear war. But that doctrine relied on a healthy dose of well-placed ambiguity, papering over the fact that NATO's members hardly agreed about when and how escalation might take place. At its most basic, however, flexible response assumed a greater role for nuclear weapons stationed in Europe. If the strategy's primary objective of deterring aggression failed, these theater nuclear forces might be used as part of a limited response. Even that terminology illustrated the fraught nature of NATO's planning. To refer to theater nuclear forces or tactical weapons ignored what would happen if these capabilities in Europe were ever used. To Europeans, how far a nuclear warhead had traveled before it hit them scarcely made a difference. Helmut Schmidt bemoaned the peculiar habit of U.S. policymakers who defined strategic weapons as only such weapons which could hit their own soil and their own cities. For Schmidt and his fellow Germans, even a strike by a battlefield nuclear weapon would be a strategic event. The uncertainties of nuclear strategy only added to these anxieties. Strategists had developed doctrines and war plans that harnessed the awesome destructive power of nuclear weapons, in the hope that those same weapons would never be used. The backbone of NATO's defenses, deterrence, relied on making threats in order to protect the status quo. Its close cousin, compellence, envisioned the use of threats to revise or restore that status quo. But the basic principles underpinning that pursuit of peace were themselves uncertain, predicated on intangibles and unprovable assumptions. An awful lot of strategic doctrine in the Cold War, one U.S. official later summed up, was mind-playing. Strategies and slogans imposed a sense of order in an attempt to alter the behavior of adversaries and allies alike, but also to reassure their architects about the
Sample complete. Ready to continue?